Did you know American and Soviet soldiers actually fought each other during World War II? It sounds like something from an alternate history novel, but it really happened. We all know the story. The Allies and the Soviet Union united against a common enemy. But the reality on the front lines was far more complicated, chaotic, and sometimes deadly. This isn't the story of grand strategies or political summits. This is the forgotten tale of when allies became enemies in the skies over Europe, a clash known as the air battle over Nice. To understand how this happened, we need to rewind to late 1944. The war in Europe was entering its final, brutal phase. The Red Army was relentlessly pushing the Germans westward across Eastern Europe, while the American and British forces were advancing from the west after the D-Day landings. On paper, they were on the same side, marching toward Berlin. But in practice, communication was a nightmare. Language barriers, different military protocols, and the sheer speed and chaos of the advance created a fog of war so thick you could cut it with a knife. There was no shared radio frequency, no unified command structure on the ground. Front lines were fluid, changing by the hour, and friendly fire was a constant, terrifying risk. The stage for our story is the city of Niš in modern-day Serbia. In early November 1944, the Soviets had just liberated the city from German occupation. For the soldiers of the Red Army's 6th Guards Rifle Corps, it was a moment of triumph and relief. They had fought hard to get here, and now they were regrouping, resupplying, and preparing for the next push. A long column of Soviet troops and vehicles stretched for miles along the road leading out of Niš, a clear and visible target from the air. The soldiers were relaxed, believing the skies were friendly. They had no idea that they were about to come under attack from their own allies. Meanwhile, high above, pilots from the United States Army Air Force's 82nd Fighter Group were on a mission. Flying their iconic P-38 Lightning fighter bombers, they had taken off from a base in Italy. Their objective was simple: find and destroy German columns retreating north from Greece. This was a classic armed reconnaissance mission. They were to patrol a designated area and attack any enemy targets of opportunity. Their target area included the very road where the Soviet column was assembled. From thousands of feet in the air, a long line of military trucks and soldiers looks pretty much the same, regardless of the flag they fly. The American pilots, believing they had spotted a German retreat, prepared to strike. On November 7, 1944, a date that ironically marked the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the American P-38s descended from the sky. They roared in low, strafing the unsuspecting Soviet column with their heavy machine guns and cannons. The attack was devastating and utterly shocking. Trucks exploded into fireballs. Soviet soldiers, who moments before had been marching victoriously, were now diving for cover, caught in a hailstorm of friendly fire. The initial assault was brutal, killing over 30 Soviet soldiers and officers, including a corps commander, General Gregory Kotov. The confusion on the ground was absolute. Who was attacking them? Were the Germans counterattacking with captured American planes? The Soviets on the ground scrambled to react. One quick-thinking officer, realizing the planes were American, frantically waved a white sheet and a Soviet flag, trying to signal the pilots. But from the cockpit of a P-38 moving at hundreds of miles per hour, such a small gesture was easily missed. The American pilots, convinced they were hitting the enemy, wheeled around for another pass. The carnage was about to get worse. But the Soviets weren't just going to sit there and take it. They had their own air cover. Down at a nearby airfield, Soviet pilots of the 866th Fighter Aviation Regiment were alerted to the attack. They scrambled their Yak-3 fighters into the air with one urgent command: intercept and stop the attackers. Led by the decorated Soviet ace Captain Alexander Koldunov, the Yaks climbed rapidly to meet the American Lightnings. What happened next was one of the most surreal and tragic dogfights of the entire war. For the first and only time in World War II, American and Soviet pilots engaged in direct intentional combat. The sky over Niz became a whirlwind of twisting, turning aircraft. P-38s and Yak-3 South, two of the best fighter planes of their respective nations, were now locked in a deadly dance. The American pilots were completely bewildered. They had been attacking what they thought were Germans, and now they were being jumped by fast, agile fighters with red stars on their wings. From their perspective, the Soviets were interfering with their mission, perhaps even protecting the German column. The Soviet pilots were equally confused, but had clear orders: defend their ground troops from the attack. In the ensuing chaos, both sides took losses. At least 2 American P-38s were shot down, and the Soviets lost several Yak-3 South. It was a short, vicious, and utterly pointless battle. Eventually, one of the Soviet pilots managed to get close enough to an American plane to fly wingtip to wingtip, frantically pointing at the Red Star insignia on his own plane. The message was finally understood. The American flight leader, realizing the catastrophic mistake, broke off the engagement and led his remaining planes away, back towards Italy. The air battle over Nice was over. In the immediate aftermath, there was a frantic scramble to contain the incident. This was a diplomatic powder keg. The last thing the Allies needed as they were closing in on Germany was a public falling out between the U.S. and the USSR. The news was immediately classified by both sides. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels were buzzing. The American ambassador in Moscow delivered a formal apology to the Soviets. Official investigations were launched, and the blame was placed squarely on a disastrous error in navigation and target identification by the American pilots. The commander of the U.S. Air Group was quietly reprimanded, and new, stricter procedures were put in place to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Both Washington and Moscow had a vested interest in burying the story. They presented a united front to the world, and this incident was an embarrassing, tragic footnote they preferred to forget. For decades, the air battle over Nice remained a secret, known only to the men who were there and a few high-level officials. The official records were sealed, and the story faded from memory, overshadowed by the larger narrative of Allied unity and victory. It was until the fall of the Soviet Union and the declassification of archives in both Russia and the United States that the full story began to emerge. So what can we learn from this forgotten clash? The air battle over Nice is a powerful reminder of the concept of the fog of war. It shows how, in the chaos of combat, even the most technologically advanced armies can make terrible mistakes. It highlights the critical importance of communication, coordination, and clear identification of friend and foe lessons that are still incredibly relevant in modern warfare. But more than that, it's a human story. It's the story of soldiers and pilots on both sides who were simply trying to do their duty and fight for their country, only to find themselves tragically pitted against their own allies. It serves as a stark counterpoint to the official narrative of perfect wartime unity. The alliance between the capitalist West and the communist Soviet Union was always a marriage of convenience, born of a common threat. Underneath the surface, there was deep-seated mistrust and ideological tension that would erupt into the Cold War almost as soon as the Second World War ended. The incident over Nice was a grim, accidental preview of that future conflict, where American and Soviet hardware would once again face off, though usually by proxy. It's a fascinating, tragic, and an important piece of history that deserves to be remembered.